Okay, so how do women gain political power? We're going to take a look at the pathways to power, as well using some examples from history and modern current leaders. Here in the United States, we've done a pretty good job. We have female leaders in Congress and the Senate. We've had women who have run for president, beginning with Shirley Chisholm, as well as Hillary Clinton, who was the first female candidate for a major political party. We've had cabinet members, Secretary of Defense, attorney generals, and now, finally, this year, Kamala Harris is the first female vice president of the United States. Well, which government position is conspicuously absent? That, of course, would be a female president here in the United States. It's a bit surprising that it still has not happened here, but I have very high hopes that it will happen very soon. When it comes to other places in the world, though, we've had women heads of state dating back to the 1960s. This began with the three women that you see listed here. SIRIMAVO Bandaranaike was the Prime Minister of Sri Lanka from 1960 to 1965. Indira Gandhi was Prime Minister of India from 1966 to 77, and then again from 1980 to 1984. And Golda Meir was the Prime Minister of Israel from 1969 to 1974. And your textbook talks about these women, gives you more of their background, and I'll let you do the reading there on your own. This graph on the right, though, what we're seeing is this huge jump from the 1980s into the 1990s of female heads of state, from 7 up to 26, and we've kind of plateaued in recent decades here, with this year, 2021, having 25 female heads of state. So what are the pathways to power? Women become heads of state or attain power positions in politics through three primary methods, according to our textbook. The first is through kinship, so these are the daughters or wives of political figures. They tend to take on what's considered the widow's walk, so they serve as political surrogates or stand-in for their deceased loved one. Hillary Clinton is a wife, but yeah, obviously Bill Clinton's not dead. She would probably be considered more of a political insider or climber, obviously having the benefit of her husband having been a person of power. I've included the photo here of Senator Mark Kelly next to his wife, Gabby Giffords. As many of us here in Arizona know, Gabby Giffords was the focus of a assassination attempt. Thankfully, she survived. But in a way, I guess we could say Mark Kelly is actually, a potential stand-in or political surrogate for the career that Gabby Giffords had attempted to start on her own. Anyway, the second pathway to power then is a political insider or a political climber. This is very common in parliamentary systems where prime ministers are elected by the parliament or granted the position. So your party gains the most seats, therefore your party determines who the leader of the government is going to be. Women attaining head of state in presidential systems, however, it's a rarer occurrence, and that's because it's dependent on the popular vote rather than, the representatives of the government choosing amongst themselves. The final pathway to power then are transitional periods, so becoming a democracy for the first time, recovering from a civil war or political instability, some sort of government scandal, corruption, or infighting, as well as active women's groups or movements. So our first example then is SIRIMAVO Bandaranaike of Sri Lanka. She was the first woman to be a head of state in the modern age. And as I said before, she served 3 terms as prime minister for Sri Lanka, the first being 1960 to 65, again in 1970 to 1977, and then finally 1994 to 2000. She actually died on her way home from having voted in 2000. During her tenure as prime minister, she defeated a coup, she nationalized large portions of the economy, actually renamed the country before it had been called Ceylon up until 1972, and her daughter actually went on to serve as prime minister and president herself. So SIRIMAVO benefited from kinship in this case. She was the widow of a powerful husband at the time of political change. Her husband, Solomon Diaz Bandaranake, was the leader of an independence movement from the independence movement from Britain. He became prime minister in 1956, but was assassinated in 1959. Following her husband's death, she was elected leader of the political party that she actually encouraged him to create in the first place. She was then elected to the Senate and eventually became prime minister. Now, she was an example of the sort of leadership style that was more similar to a male style. That's because a lot of these militaristic actions in which she engaged. She increased defense spending. She used the military to end ultra-leftist groups who felt she was not making reforms quickly enough. And lastly, she combated against the Tamils, which was an ethnic group. It's a minority group that revolted after the country became Buddhist. Benazir Bhutto of Pakistan is our next example. She was the first woman to be elected the head of a Muslim state. And she was also the first woman to give birth while in office. Her family was active in the struggle against an authoritarian regime led by General Muhammad Zia. In fact, her brother was a political exile and she herself was imprisoned. The family was very well known and grew in popularity after her father was martyred. She was released from jail due to popular pressure. And when General Zia actually died in a plane crash, she became elected prime minister. So she is again an example of kinship as a pathway to power. She used her father's image and refers to him in speeches. As you can see in the photos to the right, she's photographed very often with his image, in the background nearby. She was, however, plagued by scandal. In 1990, the president at the time dismissed charges against her of nepotism and corruption. In 1993, she was able to run for office and won. But in 1996, these same sort of charges based on corruption were dismissed again. She went into a self-imposed exile until 2007, when she actually returned to Pakistan to lead the People's Party and run for parliament. She unfortunately was assassinated by a suicide bomber during a campaign rally, and Al-Qaeda actually were the ones who claimed responsibility. But many people have questioned whether or not the President Musharraf, provided inadequate security on purpose and therefore contributed to her assassination. And I've included this quote down here in the bottom that just, again, is part of this kinship callback, calling back to her father and his political power to self-legitimize herself. Violeta de Chamorro was the president of Nicaragua from 1990 to 1997. And in this case, she rose to power through kinship as well as a period of transition. So Nicaragua is traditionally a patriarchal society. Women derive their identity from their male relatives. They submit to the demands of men and tend to just take over the home domain. She was the wife of Pedro Joaquin Chamorro Cardenal. He was a very outspoken journalist and newspaper publisher who was eventually assassinated. So during her presidency, she emphasized the role of mother and wife. She was not a feminist, though. She dedicated herself to her home, as she had been taught to by her husband. She modeled her image off of the Virgin Mary, seen as this sort of mother who was long-suffering for the Nicaraguan people. She's treated as a symbol or a representation of democracy, so the party didn't actually really want her to lead. As one political advisor put it, Violeta wasn't chosen for her abilities as president. Violeta was chosen to win. So the party wanted power. They knew they could have gained momentum from the death of her husband, so she ascended to a position of power. Angela Merkel of Germany, she is the first female chancellor of Germany and is still in power today. She grew up in East Germany and studied physics and chemistry. She eventually earned her doctorate in quantum chemistry in 1986 and worked as a research scientist until 1989, which is pretty cool. With the fall of the Berlin Wall, though, her political career began. She became deputy spokesperson for the first democratically elected East German government. After unification of the country, she was elected to the German parliament. 1991, she was appointed Federal Minister for Women and Youth, so an example of a woman gaining a cabinet position associated more with women's issues or children. 1994, she changed into a Federal Minister for Environment, Nature Conservation, and Nuclear Safety. And then in 1998, she became the Secretary General of the Christian Democratic Party, the CDU, which is the party that she is affiliated with. Now, Angela Merkel is what we would consider a political climber, but she also took advantage of some party instability to gain power. She was the first female CDU party leader, and when a donation scandal brought down the former leader, it shook up the party a bit. So, in 2005, she was elected chancellor by a majority of the delegates in the parliament. And in 2007, she actually also became president of the European Council, the EU. She is currently the longest-serving head of government in the EU. She's a senior member of the G7 summit, of the G7 leadership group, I guess. This is the group of the largest economies in the world. Her supporters, who call her Mutti, which is the term for mother, so a very endearing sort of concept. And she's considered to be one of the most powerful women in the world. Now, Jacinda Ardern, I don't know if it's Ardern or Ardern, I apologize, of New Zealand. She came to power through a little bit of a kinship relationship. Her aunt actually recruited her to help work on the campaign of a particular MP, a parliamentary member. She worked in the office of the Prime Minister as a researcher. She actually was a policy advisor to the UK Prime Minister Tony Blair. In 2008, she was elected president of the International Union of Socialist Youth, and she held numerous elected positions in the New Zealand government. She is, however, considered more of a political climber. So in 2017, she became the deputy leader of the Labour Party, after the resignation of the former leader for low poll results. She worked to increase party rankings and eventually became prime minister. At that time, she was the world's youngest female head of government at the age of 37. However, just this last year, Sanna Marin of Finland was actually voted prime minister there at the age of 34. So she's been superseded, which is great. Jacinda was also the world's second elected head of government to give birth while in office. So you can see some cute photos of her husband hanging out with their child there on the floor of Parliament, it looks like. One of the defining moments of her tenure as prime minister took place on March 15th, 2019. There was a terrorist attack that occurred during the Friday prayers in Christchurch, New Zealand. 50 people were shot and killed at 2 different mosques. Now, this was committed by an individual with far-right white supremacist views, something we're seeing, unfortunately, more and more here in the United States as well. However, within 72 hours, she changed the country's gun laws, and eventually she also helped pay for the funeral costs of the victims. So I'm going to play a speech that she gave here, again on the floor of the Parliament, which you can see is her effort to not provide this terrorist with the notoriety that he sought. And I want you to pay careful attention to the tone of the speech, and compare it to the sort of rhetoric we hear here in the United States when it comes to mass shooting events.
Assalamu alaikum. On a quiet Friday afternoon, a man stormed into a place of peaceful worship and took away the lives of 50 people. That quiet Friday afternoon has become our darkest of days. Mr. Speaker, there is one person at the centre of this terror attack against our Muslim community in New Zealand. A 28-year-old man, an Australian citizen, has been charged with 1 count of murder. Other charges will follow. He will face the full force of the law in New Zealand. The families of the fallen will have justice. He sought many things from his act of terror, but one was notoriety, and that is why you will never hear me mention his name. He is a terrorist, he is a criminal, he is an extremist, but he will, when I speak, be nameless. And to others I implore you, speak the names of those who were lost, rather than the name of the man who took them. He may have sought notoriety, but we in New Zealand will give him nothing, not even his name. Yes, the person who committed these acts was not from here. He was not raised here. He did not find his ideology here. But that is not to say that those very same views do not live here. I know that as a nation, we wish to provide every comfort we can to our Muslim community in this darkest of times. We cannot know your grief, but we can walk with you at every stage. We can and we will surround you with aroha, manaakitanga, and all that makes us us. Our hearts are heavy, but our spirit is strong. We wish for every member of our communities to also feel safe. Safety means being free from the fear of violence, but it also means being free from the fear of those sentiments of racism and hate that create a place where violence can flourish. And every single one of us has the power to change that. On Friday, there will be a week since the attack. Members of the Muslim community will gather for worship on that day. Let us acknowledge their grief as they do. Let's support them as they gather again for worship. We are one. They are us. Tātou, tātou.
So I've linked here to an opinion article from the New York Times, What Happens When Women Stop Leading Like Men. If you're interested, I suggest it. It's a very quick little read. I'll also include a PDF version of it within this week's module. So to bring things to an end for this week's module, this is the figure we started with at the beginning. This idea that underrepresentation has led to a lack of advocacy, lower status, and high levels of discrimination and violence against women. With greater representation, however, we're seeing more advocacy, lower rates of discrimination and violence, and higher status for women overall. So this is only going to keep getting better the more women we can get involved within positions of power and within politics more generally.